Title: The Hollow Pact. Ethan Sinclair always believed in control. He controlled his investments, his image, his perfectly curated life. That was, until the night he walked into his Manhattan penthouse and found his wife missing. The note on the marble countertop was short. "Don't look for me. You know why." But the thing was, he didn't. At least not at first. Plotline 1: The Vanishing. Ethan and Claire had been married for 6 years. They weren't perfect, but they were steady. Predictable. She was the kind of woman who ironed pillowcases and scheduled their dinners 3 weeks in advance. She wasn't impulsive, and she certainly wasn't the kind of woman who vanished in the middle of the night. Her credit cards were inactive. Her car was in the garage. Security cameras showed nothing except her stepping into a black sedan outside their building at 2:17 a.m. The license plate stolen. By morning, Ethan was already making calls. The police were useless. His best friend, Lucas, told him to let it go. "She left, man. Maybe you should accept that." But Ethan couldn't accept anything until he had answers. Plotline 2: The Betrayal. The more he searched, the more inconsistencies he found. Claire had withdrawn $50,000 in cash from their joint account the week before. She had visited a storage facility in Brooklyn. And then there was the flight, one booked in her name to Buenos Aires. But Claire didn't speak Spanish. She hated traveling. And then there was something worse. A hidden bank account. Over $600,000 sitting in it. A separate lease for an apartment in her maiden name. A name she hadn't used in years. She had been planning this. For months. Ethan's mind twisted with possibilities. Had she been cheating? Running from something? Or had she known something about him that made her disappear? Plotline 3: The Second Betrayal. Just when Ethan thought he was chasing a ghost, his assistant, Ivy, found something buried in Claire's old emails. A name that didn't belong. Mason Graves. Ethan knew that name, because Mason was dead. He had been Ethan's former business partner, the man he had betrayed 5 years ago in a deal that made Ethan a fortune. But Mason had vanished after that, leaving behind a scandal, a ruined reputation, and whispers that he had faked his own death. Claire knew about Mason, but how well did she know him? And why, just days before disappearing, had she emailed a dead man? The Hollow Pact, Part 2. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the name on his laptop screen. Mason Graves. A ghost. A loose end he thought had been cut long ago. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he clicked on the email chain Ivy had found. Claire's messages were short, careful. "Claire, we need to talk. I found something. Call me. Mason. Not safe. If he knows, I'm already dead. Claire, he doesn't. But I think I do. Mason. Meet me Tuesday. Same place as last time. No phone. Tuesday." The same day Claire disappeared. Ethan clenched his jaw. The pieces weren't making sense. Claire had never mentioned Mason. If she had met him before, she had hidden it well. But why? And what exactly had she found? And then there was the bigger question. If Mason was alive, what the hell did he want? Plotline 4. The Shadow in the Apartment. Ethan was back at their penthouse by midnight. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, but his hand barely made it to his lips before he noticed something. The faintest shift in the air. Presence. Someone had been here. He moved quickly, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place except for one thing. The safe in his closet. It was slightly ajar. Ethan's stomach tightened. There were only 2 people who knew the combination. Himself and Claire. Inside, everything looked untouched. Stocks, property deeds, a .45 he hadn't fired in years. But then he saw it. A single Polaroid. One that hadn't been there before. It was old, slightly curled at the edges. A photo of Ethan and Mason, taken over a decade ago in front of a half-built skyscraper in Chicago. They looked younger, reckless. Back when they still trusted each other. Scrawled across the bottom in black ink were 3 words. "You owe me." Ethan's grip tightened on the photo. If Mason had been here, that meant he wasn't hiding anymore. And that meant this wasn't just about Claire. Plotline 5. The Secret in Brooklyn. By morning, Ethan was in Brooklyn, standing in front of the storage facility Claire had rented. He paid off the attendant to skip the paperwork and was led to a cold, gray unit at the back of the lot. The metal door groaned as it rolled up. Inside, there were no suitcases, no packed bags or signs of an escape plan. Instead, there were boxes, dozens of them, stacked neatly along the walls, each one labeled with names Ethan barely recognized. Companies he had invested in, partnerships he had ended, deals he had buried. And then, at the very bottom of the stack was the folder with his name on it. Ethan flipped it open. Inside were copies of emails, financial statements, legal documents, evidence tying him to every under-the-table deal he had ever made. Things no one was supposed to know. But Claire had known, and she had been keeping proof. Ethan felt a slow, cold burn creep up his spine. His wife hadn't run away from him. She had been running because of him. And somewhere in the city, Mason Graves was waiting. The Hollow Pact, Part 3. Ethan flipped through the documents again, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just evidence, it was a death sentence. Bank transfers tied to off-the-books deals. Shell companies he thought had been dissolved. Correspondence with men who didn't like unfinished business. If this got out, he wouldn't just lose his empire. He'd lose everything. And Claire had been sitting on it for years. But why now? Why run? His mind raced, then froze on a single question. Did she run? Or was she taken? Plotline 6. The Man in the Black Sedan. Ethan left the storage unit and got back into his car. He replayed the security footage Ivy had pulled from their building. The one that showed Claire getting into a black sedan at 2:17 a.m. The license plate was stolen, but something else caught his eye. The driver. The footage was grainy, but the way the man held the wheel, the way his head tilted slightly, it felt familiar. Ethan ran through his mental Rolodex of enemies, competitors, associates turned threats. And then it hit him. Vincent Calder. A name he hadn't heard in years, but one he'd never forget. Vincent had been a fixer. The kind of man you hired when you needed something buried, deals, evidence, people. Ethan had used him once, long ago, to clean up a problem Mason had left behind. A problem that ended up at the bottom of the East River. And now Vincent was back. Which meant this was bigger than Claire. This was about unfinished business. Plotline 7. The Call from the Dead. Ethan was halfway across the Williamsburg Bridge when his phone rang. An unknown number. He let it ring twice before answering. Hello. Silence. Then a low voice, just above a whisper. Ethan. You should have left me buried. His grip tightened on the wheel. Mason. A slow chuckle on the other end. You took everything from me. My name. My business. My life. And now? You've got a bigger problem. Ethan's jaw clenched. Where's Claire? A pause. Alive. For now. His stomach twisted. What do you want? What I was owed. But now? Now I want you to feel it, Ethan. The way I did. The way she will. The line went dead. Ethan slammed his palm against the dashboard. Mason Graves wasn't back for revenge. He was back for something worse. Plotline 8. The meeting that never happened. By the time Ethan reached Ivy's apartment, she had already pulled up Mason's last known locations. He checked into a motel in Jersey 2 nights ago, she said. Paid in cash. Security footage is spotty. But we know Claire met him somewhere before that. She turned the laptop toward him. A single surveillance image. Claire. Sitting in a booth at a dimly lit diner. Across from a man with his back to the camera. Mason. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Where was this? A truck stop outside of Queens. 2 nights ago. Right before she disappeared. Ethan exhaled slowly. Claire had gone looking for Mason. But why? What did she know that he didn't? And more importantly, who else knew she had found him? Plotline 9. The clock is ticking. Ethan checked his watch. 10:42 p.m. Claire had been missing for over 48 hours. Mason was alive. Vincent Calder was in the picture. And now he had exactly 2 options. Find Mason. He was pulling the strings. If Ethan could get to him first, he might have a shot at controlling this. Find Claire. If she was still alive, she had the answers. and the evidence that could ruin him. One wrong move and everything would collapse. He looked at Ivy. "Can you trace Mason's last call?" She nodded, already typing. The screen blinked, then loaded a map. A red dot pulsed on a location near the Hudson docks. Got him. Ethan grabbed his coat and reached for his gun. Whatever was waiting for him out there, it wasn't going to end clean. The Hollow Pact, Part 4. Ethan pulled up to the Hudson docks just past midnight. The air was thick with salt and gasoline, the kind of place where bad deals were made and even worse secrets were buried. The red dot on Ivy's map had led him here, to an abandoned shipping warehouse, its rusted doors half open like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. The moment he stepped out of the car, he knew he wasn't alone. A flicker of movement near the loading bay. Shadows shifting between the stacked crates. The faintest scent of cigarette smoke. Someone was watching. And then, a voice. "You came alone." "That's stupid, Ethan." He turned sharply. A figure stepped out from the darkness. Mason Graves. Plotline 10, the ghost of the past. For a man who had supposedly been dead, Mason looked good. Leaner, harder, his face lined with years that shouldn't have passed. His hair was shorter, peppered with gray, but his eyes, those same cold, calculating eyes, hadn't changed. Ethan's grip tightened on the gun at his side. "Where is she?" Mason smirked. "Straight to business. That's always been your problem, Sinclair. I swear to God." "Relax," Mason said, stepping closer. "She's safe. For now. Why take her?" "I didn't." Ethan stilled. Mason held his gaze, waiting for the words to sink in. "Then who the hell did?" Mason's smirk faded. He reached into his coat, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he was going for a gun. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper and tossed it at Ethan's feet. Ethan hesitated, then bent down to pick it up. The moment he unfolded it, his blood ran cold. It was a photo. Claire, tied to a chair, a strip of duct tape across her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, and behind her, Vincent Calder. Plotline 11, the third player. Ethan swore under his breath. "You said you didn't take her." "I didn't," Mason repeated. "Calder did. And trust me, Ethan, you should be more worried about him than me." Vincent Calder wasn't just a fixer. He was a collector. He didn't just eliminate problems, he owned them. If he had Claire, it wasn't just about leverage. It was about control. "Why would he take my wife?" Ethan demanded. Mason exhaled slowly. "Because she wasn't just your wife, Sinclair. She was your insurance policy. And now she's a bargaining chip in a game you don't even understand yet." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Start talking." Mason hesitated. "You ever wonder how Claire found out about all of this? How she got the evidence, the money, the exit strategy?" Ethan didn't answer. "She had help," Mason said. "From someone who wanted you taken down. Someone who wanted Calder taken down, too." The words hit like a fist to the gut. "Who?" Mason glanced at him, then exhaled. "Claire was working for the feds, Ethan." Plotline 12, the ultimate betrayal. Silence. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. His mind reeled, grasping at the words, trying to reject them. "No, that's impossible." "Think about it," Mason said. "You think she just stumbled onto all your secrets? That she just happened to find all the things you've been burying for years? Come on, man. She was building a case against you." Ethan's pulse pounded. "No, she wouldn't." But even as he said it, the pieces were clicking into place. The hidden bank account, the storage unit, the careful, methodical way she had gathered the evidence, never confronting him, never tipping her hand. And now she was gone. Not because she was running, because she was caught. Because Vincent Calder had found out, too. Mason took a step closer. "Listen to me, Sinclair. If Calder has her, he's not keeping her alive to negotiate. He's keeping her alive until he doesn't need her anymore." Ethan clenched his fists. "Where is he?" Mason hesitated. "You're not gonna like the answer." Ethan grabbed him by the collar. "Where the hell is he, Mason?" Mason exhaled. "Chicago." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Chicago. The city where everything had started. The city where he and Mason had built their empire, and where Mason had lost everything. The city Ethan swore he'd never go back to. But now he didn't have a choice. Plotline 13, the return to the beginning. Ethan let go of Mason and stepped back. I'm going after her. Mason smirked. Of course you are. You coming with me? Mason tilted his head, considering. You really trust me that much? Ethan met his gaze. Not even a little. Mason chuckled. Smart man. But yeah, I'm in. If Calder wins this game, we both lose. Ethan nodded once. Then let's move. Mason grabbed his coat. One last thing, Sinclair. What? Mason grinned darkly. Before this is over, you're gonna have to decide what matters more. Saving her or saving yourself. Ethan didn't answer, because deep down he already knew the answer. And he had a feeling Mason did too. The Hollow Pact, Part 5. Chicago, 3:42 a.m. The city hadn't changed. It still smelled like wet asphalt and broken promises. The skyline was sharp, cutting through the darkness like a blade, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that coming back here was a mistake. But mistakes didn't matter anymore. Claire was somewhere in this city, and so was Vincent Calder. And by sunrise, one of them wouldn't make it out alive. Plotline 14, the setup. Mason drove while Ethan sat in the passenger seat, gripping his gun like a lifeline. They had landed in Chicago an hour ago, no luggage, no backup, just two men with too much history and a death wish. Calder's got 3 safe houses in the city, Mason said, turning down a side street. If Claire's alive, she's in one of them. Which one? That's the problem. We don't know. Ethan's patience was running thin. Then we force him to tell us. Mason glanced at him. You sure you want to go down that road? Calder's not just some guy you shake down at a bar. He's got people. And those people, they'd rather die than give him up. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then we don't go after Calder first. Mason raised a brow. Who then? Ethan clenched his jaw. We go after the people who protect him. Plotline 15, the first strike. They found the first target at a club on the west side. The Red Room, a private lounge where Calder's enforcers liked to drink and pretend they were untouchable. Inside, neon lights pulsed over black leather booths, and the music pounded like a heartbeat. Ethan scanned the room until he found who he was looking for. Dante Russo, Calder's right-hand man, the one who handled threats before they ever reached his boss. Ethan didn't hesitate. He walked straight through the crowd, grabbed Dante by the collar, and slammed him onto the table. Glass shattered. Drinks spilled. The room went silent. Dante blinked up at him, dazed. Sinclair? You've got some serious. Ethan didn't let him finish. He pressed the gun under Dante's jaw. Where's Claire? Dante smirked. Dead, probably. Ethan cocked the gun. Wrong answer. Mason leaned in, casual as ever. You know what's funny, Dante? We're not even here to kill you. We just need you to make a phone call. Dante hesitated. Call Calder, Ethan ordered. Tell him we're coming. Plotline 16, the betrayal. 20 minutes later, they had what they needed. Dante had given them the location of Calder's safe house. A high-rise apartment overlooking the river. Ethan should have felt relief, but something felt off. This was too easy, he muttered as they drove toward the river. Mason glanced at him. What do you mean? Dante's a survivor. If he gave Calder up that fast, it means Calder wanted us to know where he was. Mason exhaled. It's a trap. Ethan nodded. And we're walking straight into it. Plotline 17, the safe house. They reached the building just before dawn. It was sleek, modern, exactly the kind of place Calder would own. Ethan and Mason took the elevator to the penthouse, weapons drawn. The doors slid open. Empty. The entire floor was silent. No guards. No movement. And then, a voice from the shadows. Took you long enough. Ethan turned sharply. Claire. Tied to a chair, bruised but alive. And standing behind her, gun in hand, Vincent Calder. Smirking. Waiting. Welcome back to Chicago, Sinclair. Plotline 18. The truth comes out. Ethan's gun was already aimed. Mason moved slightly to the side, scanning the room. "Let her go," Ethan ordered. Calder chuckled. "Now, why would I do that? Because if you don't, I'll put a bullet in your skull." "You could," Calder admitted. "But then you'd never find out the truth." Ethan didn't lower the gun. "What truth?" Calder smiled. "The truth about Claire. About why she was collecting evidence on you. About who she was really working for." Ethan's pulse pounded. "She was working for the feds." Calder's grin widened. "That's what she wanted you to think." Ethan's breath caught. "What the hell are you talking about?" Claire looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Calder gestured toward her. "Go on, sweetheart. Tell him the truth." Silence. And then Claire spoke. "I wasn't working for the feds, Ethan." She swallowed hard. "I was working for Calder." Plotline 19. The final betrayal. The words felt like a gunshot. Ethan barely breathed. "No." Claire's eyes filled with something close to regret. "Yes." Ethan shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." "Why would you?" "Because I had no choice." Claire's voice cracked. "Calder had something on me. On us. If I didn't do what he asked, we were both dead." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "You lied to me. I tried to protect you. By building a case against me? By keeping you alive, Ethan." The room was spinning. Mason exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Damn." Calder chuckled. "You see, Sinclair? You and I? We're not that different. We both know the real game isn't about money or power. It's about control." Ethan's grip tightened on the gun. "What do you want?" Calder smirked. "I want you to walk away. Leave Chicago. Leave her. And never come back." Ethan's heart pounded. If he pulled the trigger, Claire would never forgive him. If he didn't, Calder would own them both. There was no way out, unless Ethan made his own rules. He glanced at Mason. A silent understanding passed between them. Then, without hesitation, Ethan fired. The Hollow Pact, Part 6. The gunshot echoed through the penthouse. For a split second, time stopped. Then, a gasp. A body hitting the floor. Blood pooling on polished marble. But it wasn't Calder. It wasn't Claire. It was Mason. Plotline 20, the wild card. Ethan hadn't hesitated. He turned his gun on Mason the second their silent agreement passed. Mason staggered back, eyes wide, clutching his side where the bullet had ripped through. "Son of a—" He dropped to one knee, blood spilling between his fingers. Calder barked out a laugh. "Now that's a surprise. Didn't see that coming, Sinclair." Ethan ignored him, stepping closer to Mason, keeping his gun leveled. "You were never here to help me, were you?" Mason coughed, pain twisting his face. "Help you? No. But I wasn't gonna kill you either." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You were playing both sides." Mason gritted his teeth. "You think you're the only one Calder had leverage on? He owns everyone in this room, Sinclair. Even you. You just don't know it yet." Ethan's stomach twisted. Claire. Mason. Calder. How many lies had he been drowning in? Plotline 21. The choice. "You should have killed him, not me," Mason rasped, nodding toward Calder. Calder smirked. "That's the thing about Ethan. He always plays it smart." Ethan's hands shook on the gun. He looked at Claire. "Did you know?" Her silence was answer enough. She knew. She had known Mason wasn't on his side. And she had said nothing. "Jesus Christ," Ethan muttered. "You're running out of time, Sinclair," Calder said. "Make your choice." Ethan stared at him. "What choice?" Calder took a step forward. "You walk away now and you live. Claire lives. I let you keep your money, your power, your little empire. But you don't come after me. You don't touch me. You disappear." Ethan's grip tightened on the gun. "And if I don't?" Calder smiled. "Then she dies. Right here. Right now." He pulled a second gun from his coat and pressed it against Claire's temple. Tick-tock, Sinclair. Ethan's mind raced. There had to be a way out. A way to save Claire. A way to win. And then, an idea. One last move. One final gamble. He glanced at Mason, who was still on the floor, breathing raggedly. Then at Claire, who met his eyes with something unreadable. Then at Calder. And Ethan did something no one expected. He lowered the gun. Plotline 22. The final play. All right, Ethan said. You win. Calder's smirk widened. Smart man. Ethan took a slow step back. Then another. His hands raised. Claire's eyes widened slightly, like she knew what he was doing. So did Mason. Ethan, he started. But it was already too late. Because the moment Calder eased his grip on Claire, Ethan moved. One quick, precise motion. His hand shot to the knife in his jacket, hidden unseen. Before Calder could react, Ethan drove the blade straight into his ribs. Deep. Calder's breath hitched. His gun clattered to the floor. Ethan leaned in, voice low. You should have never given me a choice. Then he twisted the knife. Calder let out a choked gasp, staggered back, and collapsed onto the marble, his blood staining the floor. The king had fallen, and the game had just changed. Plotline 23. The aftermath. Silence. Then Claire spoke. Is he dead? Ethan wiped the blood off his hands. Not yet. Mason groaned from the floor. Well, that was dramatic. Ethan glanced at him. Shut up. Claire pushed herself up from the chair, rubbing her wrists where the rope had been. She looked at Calder's body, then at Ethan. What now? Ethan didn't answer right away. Calder was out of the picture, but that didn't mean they were safe. Mason was still bleeding out. Claire was still hiding secrets. And outside this penthouse, Calder's men were waiting. Ethan exhaled. We finished this. Claire frowned. Finish what? Ethan picked up Calder's fallen gun, checked the clip, and looked at her. Everyone who played this game, we make sure they never play again. Mason chuckled weakly. You're talking about war, Sinclair. Ethan glanced at him. No, he said. I'm talking about winning. The Hollow Pact, Part 7. Chicago, 4:21 a.m. The penthouse was dead silent, except for the slow, ragged breathing of Vincent Calder. He wasn't gone yet. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, blood pooling beneath him. His once smug grin was gone, replaced by something almost surprised, like he had never imagined a world where he wasn't the one pulling the strings. Ethan crouched beside him, watching the light flicker in his eyes. You should have killed me first, Calder rasped, voice weak. Ethan tilted his head. Maybe, but this way, you get to watch what happens next. Calder's fingers twitched, trying to move, trying to grasp at something. But it was useless. The king had fallen, and now the board was Ethan's. Plotline 24. Loose ends. Mason groaned from the floor, his hand still pressed to his bleeding side. Hey, Sinclair? Not to interrupt your villain monologue, but I'm still bleeding out here. Ethan glanced at him, considering. Mason was a wild card, always had been. Keeping him alive was a risk, but killing him now would be sloppy. You'll live, Ethan said, standing up. Mason smirked. Damn. Almost sounded like you cared for a second. Claire shifted, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had bitten into her skin. She was still staring at Calder, something dark in her eyes. Ethan turned to her. You knew, didn't you? She didn't flinch. Knew what? That Mason was working both sides. Mason chuckled weakly. Come on, Sinclair. Give her some credit. She played you just as well as she played me. Ethan's jaw tightened. What's your angle, Claire? She met his gaze steady. Survival. Simple. Direct. Honest. In a way that made Ethan hate her even more. Because the truth was, she wasn't the only one playing for survival. Plotline 25. The escape plan. We need to move, Claire said, breaking the silence. Calder's men will be coming. Ethan nodded, already thinking ahead. He had two options. Clean house. Wipe out Calder's remaining men before they came looking for payback. Disappear. Take Claire, take the money, and vanish before the city swallowed them whole. But there was a third option. One no one expected. We don't run, Ethan said. We take over. Mason let out a pained laugh. Jesus, you always did think bigger than the rest of us. Claire frowned. Take over what, Ethan? Calder's empire is built on blood. His people won't follow you just because you put a knife in his ribs. They will if they think I'm the only thing keeping them alive. The room fell silent. Ethan had spent years tearing down men like Calder. He knew how they worked, how they thought. And right now, Calder's empire was leaderless, which meant it was vulnerable, which meant it was his. Plotline 26. The last threat. Then, a noise. Footsteps. Outside, beyond the penthouse doors. Ethan and Claire exchanged a glance. Mason cursed under his breath. They're here, Claire whispered. Ethan tightened his grip on his gun. There was no time for debate. No time for regrets. It was time to end this. Plotline 27. The final stand. The first man through the door didn't even have time to react. Ethan fired once, the bullet hitting him square in the chest. The second man ducked, raising his weapon. Claire was faster. She grabbed Calder's fallen gun and put a bullet through his skull before he could aim. Mason, despite his injury, managed to push himself up, dragging his own weapon into his hands. More men were coming. 3, 5, more. The penthouse was about to turn into a war zone. Ethan glanced at Calder's motionless body. Your kingdom's burning, he muttered, then turned back toward the fight. The door burst open again, and the real battle began. The Hollow Pact, Part 8. Chicago, 4:27 a.m. The first gunshot had barely faded before the second man came through the door. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pivoted, aimed, fired. A clean shot, straight through the chest. The man staggered back, his gun slipping from his fingers as he collapsed against the doorway. Then the real storm began. Shouts echoed down the hallway. More men, more guns. Ethan crouched behind the marble countertop, reloading with the precision of a man who had done this before. Across the room, Claire had taken cover behind the leather couch, her stolen gun clutched tightly in her hands. Mason, still bleeding, had managed to drag himself behind the bar, his breath ragged. How many? Claire called out. Ethan risked a glance. At least 4 more. Maybe more down the hall. Mason let out a strained laugh. Great. Love these odds. Another burst of gunfire tore through the penthouse, splintering the wooden furniture. A bullet missed Ethan's head by an inch, burying itself in the wall behind him. They were boxed in. No way out. Unless... The balcony, Ethan said suddenly. Claire's eyes flickered toward it. Are you insane? We're 40 floors up. Do you have a better idea? A hesitation. Then, damn it. Claire fired 2 more rounds toward the door, buying them a few seconds. Mason groaned. I hate this plan already. You're not the one who has to jump? Ethan muttered, grabbing Mason under the arm and hauling him toward the glass doors leading to the balcony. Bullets followed them, shattering the glass as they staggered outside. The cold wind cut through them instantly, the city stretching out below. No escape, except for one. The penthouse next door. A 6-foot gap between balconies. Too far for Mason in his condition. Too far for Claire in a dress and heels. Too far for all of them. But it was the only way. Ethan turned to Mason. Can you hold them off? Mason smirked, blood staining his teeth. Wouldn't be the first time. He pulled a fresh magazine from his pocket, shoving it into his gun with a shaky hand. Go! Plotline 28. The leap of faith. Claire climbed onto the ledge first, her hands gripping the cold metal railing. She took a deep breath, muttered something under her breath, then jumped. For a second, Ethan thought she wasn't going to make it. Then her hands caught the opposite railing. A second later, she pulled herself up and over. Ethan turned back to Mason. Mason was leaning heavily against the broken glass door, gun raised. His face was pale, his breath short. Go, Mason said again. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't the sentimental type, but leaving Mason here alone, bleeding, to buy them time, it didn't sit right. Mason caught the look, smirked, I was a dead man the second I walked back into your life, Sinclair. He gave a weak nod toward the ledge. Don't waste it. More gunfire. Ethan clenched his jaw, then turned, and jumped. The cold air ripped past him. For half a second he was weightless. Then impact. His hands slammed against the opposite balcony railing. His ribs crushed against the steel. Claire reached out, grabbed his arm. I got you. With one last push, Ethan pulled himself over, landing hard on the concrete floor. Across the gap, Mason gave one last nod. Then he turned back toward the penthouse, gun raised. A final stand. Ethan didn't wait to watch how it ended. Claire grabbed his wrist. We have to go. They vanished into the darkness. Mason's last bullets echoed behind them. Then silence. Plotline 29. The escape route. They moved fast. Through the neighboring penthouse. Down the emergency stairwell. Out the service entrance. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they stepped onto the freezing Chicago streets, blending into the shadows. For now they were ghosts. Claire exhaled, her breath visible in the cold air. We need a car. Ethan scanned the street. We need more than that. They needed a plan. Because Calder's men wouldn't stop coming. Not until Ethan was dead. Not until they were both dead. Claire turned to him, her expression unreadable. So what now? Ethan exhaled. Now? We finish what we started. She frowned. Which is what, exactly? Ethan's eyes flickered toward the skyscraper towering above them, where a war had just begun. We burn Calder's empire to the ground. Plotline 30. The real enemy. They drove in silence. Claire at the wheel, Ethan scanning the roads. Every car felt like a tale. Every shadow felt like a threat. Then, Claire spoke. There's something I didn't tell you. Ethan didn't look at her. Shocking. Calder wasn't the one pulling the strings. That made him look. What? Claire gripped the wheel tighter. Calder was powerful, but he wasn't the top. There's someone else. Someone bigger. Ethan frowned. Who? Claire hesitated. Then, the man who gave me the orders. The one who forced me to spy on you. The one Calder answered to. She exhaled. His name is Dominic Vale. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that name. And suddenly everything made sense. Calder had never been the endgame. He was just another piece on the board. And the real enemy? The real enemy was still waiting in the dark. Watching. Waiting. Planning. Ethan clenched his fists. Where do we find him? Claire hesitated. Then, New York. Ethan exhaled. Of course it wasn't over. Because in this game, it was never over. The Hollow Pact, Part 9. Chicago, 5:02 a.m. The city blurred past them in streaks of neon and headlights. Claire's hands gripped the wheel, white-knuckled. But her face was calm, too calm. Ethan watched her out of the corner of his eye, trying to piece together whether she was still playing him. Dominic Vale. The name sat in his mind like a loaded gun. Vale wasn't just another crime boss. He was something worse. A man who didn't just pull strings, he owned them. A kingmaker. The kind of power that didn't show up in police reports because he wrote the reports. If he was behind all of this, Ethan had been playing the wrong game from the start. Tell me everything, he said, voice low. Claire exhaled, eyes locked on the road. Vale had me on his payroll long before I met you. Ethan's pulse ticked faster. You were spying on me from the beginning? She hesitated. Not at first. It started as a background check. Routine. Vale wanted to know if you were useful or if you were a threat. Ethan clenched his jaw. And? Claire's fingers tightened on the wheel. Both. That stung. And Calder. Ethan pressed. Calder was Vale's middleman, Claire said. He handled operations, but Vale controlled the money. Calder got reckless. Vale was looking for an excuse to cut him loose. Ethan frowned. And you? Claire hesitated. I was supposed to set you up, Ethan. Silence. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. I didn't. Why? Claire swallowed. Because I fell in love with you. Ethan let out a slow, measured breath. And yet, you still built a file on me. Claire flinched. I thought I could control it. Keep you safe. Keep us safe. Ethan exhaled sharply. Well, you did a hell of a job with that. Claire didn't respond. The car sped down the highway, slicing through the night. New York was waiting. So was Dominic Vale. And Ethan Sinclair was done playing defense. Plotline 31. The hunter becomes the hunted. By the time they hit the private airstrip, the sun was starting to bleed into the horizon. Ethan made a quick call. Within 30 minutes, a jet was waiting. He stepped onto the tarmac, scanning the area. No tails. No incoming threats. For now. This is reckless, Claire muttered beside him. We need to plan. We don't have time. Ethan pulled open the jet's door. Vale already knows Calder is dead. He's either expecting us or he's setting a trap. Exactly, Claire said. Which is why we shouldn't just walk into New York like we own the place. Ethan smirked. But we do, don't we? She didn't argue. Because they both knew the truth, Ethan had power in New York. Not as much as Vale, but enough to cause damage. Enough to make people nervous. And nervous people made mistakes. Plotline 32. Welcome to New York. The jet landed at a private airstrip outside the city. Ethan had arranged for a car. Black. Unmarked. Impossible to trace. They drove in silence. The weight of everything pressing down on them. Where do we start? Claire finally asked. Ethan stared ahead. Vale's money, he said. If we can choke his funding, we can force him into the open. Claire hesitated. You have an idea, don't you? Ethan's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. I have an insurance policy. Claire's brow furrowed. What kind of insurance? Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out a phone, and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line clicked, a voice on the other end. This is unexpected. Ethan smirked. Hello, Senator Monroe. Claire's eyes widened. You called a senator? Ethan leaned back in his seat. Vale's money runs through politicians, banks, and offshore accounts. And I know exactly which ones. The senator's voice was wary. Ethan, if this is about what I think it is, you should turn around and leave town. Not happening. You don't understand, Vale doesn't just kill people. He erases them. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. Then I guess we'd better erase him first. Plotline 33. The first move. By nightfall, Ethan and Claire were in a high-rise overlooking the city. The plan was simple. Freeze Vale's offshore accounts. Leak his financials to the media. Cut him off from his power before he even knew what hit him. But then, a knock at the door. Ethan's gun was in his hand instantly. Claire moved to the side, pressing herself against the wall. Ethan opened the door just a crack, and frowned. The man standing there was familiar. Too familiar. He wore a sharp suit, a knowing smirk, and a confidence that came from being untouchable. Hello, Sinclair. Ethan's blood ran cold, because standing in front of him wasn't just some messenger. It was Dominic Vale himself. Plotline 34. The devil in the flesh. Vale stepped inside like he owned the place. Ethan didn't lower the gun. Bold move walking in here alone, Ethan said. Vale chuckled. Who said I'm alone? Ethan glanced toward the window, movement on the rooftops. Snipers. Vale sighed. Relax. If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead already. Then why are you here? Vale tilted his head. To offer you a way out. Ethan exhaled slowly. You're joking. Not at all. You're a businessman, Sinclair. So am I? Calder was sloppy. You're efficient. Precise. I could use someone like you. Claire stiffened. You want to hire him? Vale ignored her. His eyes stayed on Ethan. You're good at this, Sinclair. But you can't win. You know you can't. So why fight a war you can't survive? Ethan held his gaze. Vale leaned in slightly. Work for me. Or die fighting me. Your call. Silence. Claire looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Vale. And for the first time since this all started, he wasn't sure what his next move was. The Hollow Pact, final part. New York. 9:12 p.m. The room felt smaller, tighter. Ethan's gun was still in his hand, but it felt heavier now. Dominic Vale stood in front of him, confident, calculated, the kind of man who had never heard the word no and lived to tell about it. His offer hung in the air. Work for me, or die fighting me. A choice, but was it real, or just an illusion, designed to make Ethan feel like he still had control? Claire stood to the side, tense, waiting. Ethan could feel her eyes on him, waiting for him to make the call. Plotline 35. The only move left. Ethan inhaled slowly, exhaled. Then he lowered the gun. Not all the way, just enough to make Vale think he was considering it. Because that's what Vale wanted: control, power, the satisfaction of knowing he had won. Ethan had spent his life manipulating people, and he knew one thing for sure: the moment someone believes they've won is the moment they're weakest. "I'll need time," Ethan said. Vale smirked, as if he expected this answer. "Of course," he said. "Take a day. Think it over." Ethan nodded. Vale turned to leave, and that's when Ethan made his move. Plotline 36. The final shot. It happened fast. Ethan's gun was up before Vale even took his second step. A single shot, straight to the chest. Vale staggered. His smirk faded, replaced with something rare: shock. His hands clutched at the wound as he sank to his knees. "You," he gasped. Ethan took a step closer, standing over him. "You thought I'd work for you?" Ethan said, voice calm. Vale's fingers twitched, reaching for something. Maybe a gun. Maybe nothing. Ethan fired again. Kill shot. Dominic Vale slumped forward. Dead. Plotline 37. The fallout. Silence filled the room. Claire let out a slow breath, stepping closer. "Jesus, Ethan." He turned to her. It was the only way. She didn't argue, because she knew it was true. Vale had never planned to let them walk away. Whether Ethan took the deal or not, he would have been disposable. A loose end. And loose ends didn't survive men like Vale. But now the king was dead, which meant the empire was up for grabs. Claire swallowed hard. What happens next? Ethan turned to the window, looking out over the city. We end it. For good. Plotline 38. Burning the kingdom. By midnight it was over. Ethan and Claire moved fast, cutting through Vale's network before his men even knew what happened. Accounts were frozen. Safe houses burned. By morning, Dominic Vale's empire was nothing but smoke and whispers. Power vacuum was left in its place. One that Ethan had no interest in filling. Plotline 39. The final escape. 2 days later, Ethan and Claire sat in a private airport lounge, waiting for a flight that didn't exist on any public record. A one-way ticket to nowhere. "Where are we going?" Claire asked. Ethan took a sip of his drink. "Anywhere but here." Claire studied him. "You really think we can just disappear?" Ethan met her gaze. "We just killed the most powerful man in the city. If we stay, we won't make it a week." Claire exhaled. "So that's it? We just run?" Ethan smirked. "For now." She nodded, leaning back in her seat. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to fight. No more enemies. No more betrayals. Just the two of them. Survivors. The intercom crackled. "Flight 902 now boarding." Ethan stood. "You ready?" Claire hesitated. Then she took his hand. "Yeah." Together, they walked toward the plane, toward a new life. And for the first time in years, Ethan Sinclair was free. The end.